Ollie Leroux.
If there was any Durban faithful here, they'd tell you his name is really Ollie. And Andre Henry Leroux was born in Fort Beaufort in the Eastern Cape and was also educated at Grey College in Bloemfontein. After making his Test debut in 1994 at the tender age of just 21, Ollie returned to the Springbok squad in 1998. He's now become a regular member of the Test team. Ladies and gentlemen, Ollie Leroux.
Yeah, he's always teasing everyone, and he's such a relaxed person. He doesn't worry about things as long as he just wants to be happy and everything. Like that's why if you see him, Ollie's always got a smile on his face. He's not worried about anything, and especially in the game, he enjoys his game so much. And I mean, especially running. If he gets the ball and getting a drive, he loves it.
From Ollie Leroux, right to the line, he's there. What an outstanding try from Ollie Leroux and the Sharks. Putt. Thompson, Joubert, Ollie Leroux, that's two to Ollie. Tremendous effort.
There you go. It's a pleasure, bro. All the best. Nice meeting you.
Now, Mariska, you sit there in the stands waiting for Ollie to come onto the field. Is it quite an exciting moment, or is the exciting sort of time gone by the time he gets on the field?
I know, it's always nice to watch him come up. I don't know, it's just not the same when he's not on the field.
Van der Westhuizen. That's a good move by Van der Westhuizen. Oh, look at this! Look at this by Ollie Leroux!
Make sure that they get back into this match. Touch on the inside. Well, that's going to be a try then to Ollie Leroux.
Well. Ollie Leroux. Now, I don't know whether he's ever kicked a goal before in his life.
No. Whoa, Andre. What do you think you're doing, bro? You're trying a hamburger. You're not sitting at the Sunday afternoon roast with your mother. You don't try a hamburger with a knife and fork. Plonk it on top, grab it, and just dig it. Yes, on that
Towards the touchline, but South Africa have done well to recycle this. Andre Foster, Ollie Leroux. He won't be stopped. No, indeed he won't. Big Ollie Leroux, fresh legs, barges his way over, and South Africa are really back in this
1992 to 1993 season.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Listen, thank you so much for tuning in. This is actually the first episode of 2026. Well, at least the first episode that I'm recording in 2026. So yes, please, if you do enjoy the podcast episode, which I know for a fact you will, please go ahead, drop a comment, drop a like, and please go subscribe. It is free. I really would appreciate it. By the end of the year, I would like to reach 10,000 subscribers. If you guys could make that possible for me, I'd be super grateful. But enough talking. Without further ado, today I have somebody that is considered by many, including myself, to be a legendary South African rugby player. Won many titles, formed part of different great title-winning sides, and since making his Springbok debut on the 4th of June 1994, he accumulated 54 Test caps. Without further ado, today I have with me Ollie Leroux. How's the introduction? Not bad, eh?
Special. Thanks, Jason, and it's great to be on your podcast.
Thanks for coming, man.
We can add some value.
Yeah, of course. So your name, it's not actually Ollie.
No. My real name is Andre Henry, and when I got to grade, it's always funny. You get there and stand at 16, you got to learn all the seniors' names and everything, and then your team, your roommates. You still got to learn their names, and Andre Henry is quite young. And then my one friend, Delaray Brugman, said, "No, guys, this ain't going to work. There's too many names." And he basically told us, and we started giving each other names. And I think I was Ollie for Little Elephant. There was a guy called Camel. There was a guy called Makwasi, a guy called Doc, a guy called Spep. You know, so we had all these nicknames just to survive in the first initiation phase, because you have to know all the seniors' names, so it was insane. So I think it was a bit of a survival method, but the name actually worked out well for me.
You said standard 6 for us young people, which
grade 8, grade 8. Yeah, we were still in the old days.
So tell me about life before Grey College, because I know that you were born in Fort Beaufort.
No. So I was born in Fort Beaufort, and then my parents, we were living in Cape Town and Joburg. My father was working for the government at that stage. And then we went actually and stayed in Johannesburg. So I grew up in Johannesburg, in the northern suburbs, Northcliffe and Roosevelt Park. My sister still stays in our home that we lived there. And I went to a school called Lou Geldenhuis. Lou Geldenhuis was in Linden. It's a very strong Afrikaans community in that area. And they're still very strong schools today. Help Mekaar, you also know the name. You know, so we were basically the Joburg Afrikaans guys, and what was interesting, my one friend Stefan Berger and myself, we played squash together. So Lou Geldenhuis had a squash team that won the league that year, with me and him in the team and 2 other guys, and we actually both played for Transvaal. And there I met a lot of the squash guys. It was a very a lot of the private school kids played squash. You know, the St. Stithians guys and all those guys. So we became very good friends with guys that were playing squash. So the rest of my when I went to Grey, obviously I could play squash, and I made the second team, which gave me a bit of street cred in standard 6, and the first team in grade 9, which is standard 7. And so squash was also a big part of that journey of me. We played at Northcliffe Corner every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, having to drive up and down those hills with my bike, who made my legs strong. So I believe that was a good foundation for my success eventually on the rugby field.
Sure. So I noticed that you spoke about your sister. How many siblings do you have?
Yeah, so I've got a mother and 3 sisters, and they're all older than me. I was the 4th, and we had my elder sister Karen. She's 11 years older than me. Then Ilse, she's about 10 years older, and then my other sister Ulrika, which was 6 years older. And I always laugh. And then I was blessed with my wife Mariska, and my 4 daughters, Mia, Chloe, Lisa, and Donna. And I'm probably the guy that's been around women my whole life more than most people. So I still don't understand the female, but I've got a rough idea how to work with them.
No, well, if you can't understand, then what do the rest of us have?
Just give them love. What does the Bible says? Husbands, love your wives, and wives, respect your husbands. I think that's a good principle to start on, and if you can apply that to your relationship, I think there's definitely ways that it will work out somehow. But it's the relationships and between the genders are more difficult.
You know, Ollie, I'm quite interested to find out what was your upbringing like. For example, what values did your mom and dad try instill from a very young age?
Yeah, I think it was a very different society then. Obviously, apartheid was still relevant. And what's interesting, my father was liberal in that view, you know, and he struggled with the system because it's a system of hierarchy and bureaucracy and stuff, and we're known as rebels. My father played under Donnie Craven. He was in the Buescoop team, so he played for Marties, he played for False Bay when they won the championship in those days. So I really got brought up in a very competitive environment. My father was a tough man and but also fun loving. And obviously with my mother, you know, in those days she was a teacher and I was a bit young, so you end up being like the only child basically, you know. And then when I went to Grey when I was 13, they basically snipped that little cord between you and your mother, and you've got to man up, you know. So it was a very powerful home I grew. I mean, we always sat around the dinner tables, and there would always be these intense discussions about stuff, you know. So it was never a authoritarian, patriotic system. It was actually a very inclusive system, and yeah, my parents obviously struggled a bit, and they eventually got divorced when I was 21, which was tough. And then from there, both of them lived their lives. They were actually better apart than together, I think. And today, my mother's 89, still driving her own car, going to buy 3 times a week. She flew to San Diego a couple of years ago to go visit my sister. You know, and my father died just at the start of COVID. I think he was 83. So and we always loved sport. My parents always played tennis, and we always had swimming competitions. You know, and I was a youngster, I had to swim. So I think that brought a lot of the competitive spirit out of me. And then it was interesting when I moved into the ranks of rugby, and I actually made my debut in 1993, because how it works with the Springboks, if you go and you play a test, you're not allowed to wear your blazer until you've played a test, except if you go on a tour. Okay. Because then you get your blazer beforehand, because on tour it's difficult. You never know if you're going to play a test, because there's 30 players. And how that works out. You know, when we started in those days, you had 30 players going on tour with 6 management. I think just the support staff now is about 36 people that has to do the logistics, and the team is about 45. So you'd actually end up, I think Ruben Kruger played something like 13 games out of 14 on tour. And you actually played yourself fit, you know, so it was a very different environment. We played Monday, we'd play Wednesday, Saturday, and then if it was a test, we'd play on Tuesdays. So you had this 30-man squad, and if you won, you just played rugby the whole time. So it's very different than today. We know the bomb squad then wasn't something that was used. It actually started a lot with Ian McIntosh, which had a problem because he had Robbie Kempson, Adrian Garvey, and Ollie LaRue in the team, and all 3 of us believe we're the best and we have to play. And how he managed that, you know, was by basically using a bomb squad principle. And as he used that, Mick Mallet said, well, it's working, let's copy it, because he had the same problem at the Springboks. You know, here's Robbie, Ollie, Adrian Garvey, but who do we pick? And if you don't pick one, and then Os came in, the other guy feels like he's not good enough, and, you know, it was very different. It wasn't like we're doing this, it was for your own ego sometimes there as well. And eventually the stats just showed if you do it just your efficiency is so much better. So it was actually quite a journey to where the Springboks are now and from where we started.
Yeah, now before we get into the Springboks, when did you start playing rugby?
Yeah, so I actually always played rugby. I made my debut, for all places, on Robben Island. I was in grade 1. And what happened is we had a little school, it's called Acacia Park. So all the government officials must travel in the winter to Joburg, and then in summer they came down to Acacia Park and they stayed there. And they needed a guy to play, and I was playing with the grade 3s. Well, I was grade 1, and the teacher came and said, I need a guy to come play for the grade 3s. And we still went, and I was playing with these big guys, you know, you're still small. And I remember we were running, and you'd be running, and there'd be little double-keys, little thorns, and I could stop and actually pull out thorns on Robben Island. So that was my first rugby match that I played. And then obviously from there, I basically had the right profile for a rugby player, quick off the mark, big, strong. That's what it took in the, you know, it still takes that. And I always tended to play a year ahead of me, you know, so I could always play with the guys a year ahead of me, and even 2 years ahead, but it gets a bit much. And I went to Geldenhuys, played there, played Transvaal Schools, grade 6 and grade 7. And then I came to Grey, and I played in the 8 teams always. I played Cherries first team in Standard 9, and we had an amazing team. We had 5 very good Standard 9s that made this team strong. And the 1990 Grey College team was probably one of the most amazing teams that in that era. And we followed on, and then the next year I was actually in the team that lost the first time in 86 games in 5 years. That we had built a record. You know, from when I arrived at school, we never lost, and I was So that was quite traumatic, and that then we lost another game that season was against Paul Roos, and that side had Justin Swart. He had a post-matric because he lost the previous year to us, and he's not going to end his year like that. So we played against the bloody post-matric, a couple of them. And Kobus Versage was in that game, Johanni van Wyk, some really, really good players. And they beat us, and they were named the Invincibles. And I always laugh at them and say, the only thing that made you great was you beat us, you know. And it just shows you what an excellent history Grey has of producing excellence over and over and over again. And we had an interesting conversation a while ago, I think with Damian Willemse. Parel Boys High was on 38 games, and Mark Johain undefeated. I said, do you know of any other team that's been undefeated many games and everything? And there was this big discussion actually going. I said, well, I know I lost in the 87th game, and then twice after that we've gone 48 games without a loss. But we're used to winning, so we don't really keep records like that, you know. And then the discussion was over. But I think it was amazing, you know, if you look back at life, I would have been successful probably in most other places because I'm a good athlete and I loved sport and everything. But going to Grey, you know, you learn to fend for yourself. You a lot of trauma that goes with that. But it also it's a place where the values and the excellence that it brings just makes you so tough. For what life brings to you. So going to Grey was definitely an amazing path of my growth and evolution to going to the rugby field. And if you just look at Grey's track record, when the guys get at the highest level, they just fit in. There's no, you know, it's tough because the guys are older, but the competition at Grey, the excellence at Grey, you're used to that. So when you go to any high performance system, coming out of a place like Grey, you know, we worried a bit every now and then when we see now, you know, the inconsistency there is, but it just leaves you, and it leaves you with a band of brothers for the rest of your life. You know, you basically got guys that went through, and to this day when we go to reunions and stuff, you know, the band of brothers and the challenges life has thrown at them. You know, it's much bigger than just playing a bit of rugby and stuff. It's actually something that you cherish much more when you're older.
But on that point, from your perspective, what do you think is the main contributing factor to Grey College's excellence on the rugby field and their dominance over how many years? Or what do you think makes Grey so great?
Yeah, obviously, if you look at where Grey started, and I stand to be corrected, but I've done a bit of research because a lot of people come to Grey and, you know, they're there for 5 years and then they always criticize and they always have something to say, especially the mamas. And I basically tell them, you know, Grey's has been in existence since 1855 or 75.
55.
Yeah, 55, you know, and you actually have an opinion. Could you just shut up? Because look what the school's done over so many years. And then if you go look at Grey and you see the Sir George Grey, the foundation that he created, the blueprint for Grey in 1855. You must go read that document. At least read it like the Freedom Charter. We're going to create a system where people will add value to this country. And then also one thing he said, which was interesting, and then you can imagine how this is like the Boer War and all that stuff going on in those days. He basically said, Grey College, we need to work with these Afrikaners, but we have to make them gentlemen. So one of the biggest values of Grey is to be a gentleman. And when there's sayings, when the occasion demands, the Grey gentleman comes up to scratch. So that propaganda from 1855 with that value system. And he also said Grey must always be a dual medium so that the Afrikaner can work with the English guy. And if you just look at the evolution of Grey, and then that's amazing how when apartheid came down and suddenly obviously that whole imbalance has to be rectified. If you look at Grey today, it's still the English and the Afrikaans class. And the other day I got a father that came in and he was English and he was a black parent, and we chatted to him, and in our days the English were always a bit of the naughty guys. The accent would English just were more liberal than the Afrikaners, especially in those days. And And a guy like yes, I've lost my train of thought now. I must just get back to it. But if you look at Gray today, and a father came to me and he started speaking, he said, "Hey, your son," and his daughter was in Oranje, and it's weird because this beautiful girl comes and she speaks this amazing Afrikaans, and it's like if you grew up in that system that we were, sometimes it's a shock to you because you just never had the opportunity to actually engage with people, you know, because it was a law, you weren't allowed to. So you know, you grew up in this. And we said, yes, but you English and your daughter's Afrikaans. Why is she in Oranje? And he said, I love the values of the school, the discipline of the school, and I believe my kid must be exposed to different cultures and learn, because that's what the world's about. And then he said, but my son's in Grey, but yes, he's in the Afrikaans class because those English oaks are too naughty, you know. And that's Grey. You've got balance in Grey. You've got different. If you look, I remember we always had Micha Heinz was my principal, and then we had a guy like Andre Volstedt. And you know, he grew up on those school grounds, and they'd always tell you the stories about the people on the boards. And one of the classic stories is the guy that was the founder of the HNP in those days. It was some conservative Afrikaans political party. And 2 years later was the guy that was one of the founders of the Communist Party, was in the same school. And that's great. It allows you to have certain values of which you can go and actually go and change the world. If you see the people that's come through there, you know, guys in my class was in the COVID strategy guys from Delft. They were these amazing. We had guys writing symphonies in our days. Grey always has the value to do sports and the culture, you know, so there were clear guidelines that Grey, and what I've found when Grey now becomes, you know, with the social media and people becoming aware of the school, there's one thing that we always look at, and I think it's a value that if you go to Grey and you try everything in your ability to make Grey great, it makes you great. But if you go to Grey for you to be great, then suddenly it just devalues the school. And I think that value system today, with people being very instant gratification, it's about me, I'm going to play SA schools, I'm going to go there and there and there. But they don't understand. Just make sure you go into Grey with one, I'm going to make Grey great. And it will be, you will be shocked at what Grey then gives back to you. If you just look at the alumni right across the world, people in the places they are. And then there's also guys that went through tough times, you know, and that life has taken to places, and you never leave a brother behind. And when we see them at the reunions, we always equals. There's no status there. Hey, bro, you like a Grey Standard 6 boy that walked in here. And I think that band of brothers is something very special for Grey, and that you can be held accountable for, you know, at the end of the day. To those values, and some people use them, some people don't use them, some people never get out of Grey, you know, a lot of their identity is still, hey, I was in Grey, which is great. It's a great tick on your box, but you're so much more than just that. But the foundation laid in Grey sets you up for success in life in any aspect.
So, okay, now you finished up with school. Standard 10.
Grade 12,
grade
12 standard 10.
Okay, yeah, you finished up with grade. What year did you matriculate?
I matriculated in 1991.
Okay, 1991. So then in 1994 you made your debut. So in the interim, what exactly were you doing?
Yeah, so what was interesting, after I was at Grey, I went to Wits. I studied at Wits. Okay. So you can imagine coming from this flippin' enclosed, going to Wits, that was insane. And I played rugby for them, full bursary and everything. And I studied industrial engineering.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah. So I could do that, and I actually played too much rugby, but going into Joburg, that was good fun. Huh? And at the end of the year, I didn't pass. I just didn't make it. Engineering is a tough course, and then the gentleman that recently passed away, Tat Botha, said, "Hey, Ollie, what you doing next year? Why don't you come to the Free State?" So I packed my little squash bag with my clothes. I think I hiked down with my couple of squash records, and I went to Vishuis. And what's amazing, in 1993, I started in Vishuis, sitting on the bench for the hostel first side. And then I went from there to the Shimla on the 20 side. I went from there to the Shimla first side. I went from there to the Free State on the 20 side, to the Free State B side, to the Free State A side, to the Springbok side. So I basically had 7 initiations that year every time I got into a new team, and I ended up playing for the Springboks in 1993 as a 20-year-old. So that was an incredible pathway. And then obviously in 94, then I made my debut, and there was actually quite a nice story about that. We came back, and the guys on the tour, then we got invited to a Springbok training camp. So we got there and we did the specific test where you run 5 meters, 10 meters, 15 meters, 20 meters, 25 meters and back, and then you stop and they measure it, and you have to run 6 in a row to see how fit you are, okay, or to get a measurement for your test. And I ran that test, but I was by far the quickest for the first 3, and then my endurance left, and I still got on the plane, and Gijsie Pienaar was there, and I said, yes, Gijsie, I don't feel I'm fit enough. Would you help me be fit? Okay, and remember we were amateurs at that stage. So I said, no problem, Ollie. So I'd get him between 12 and 2, and I'd get him at the Free State Stadium on a Monday. Then we'd jog all the way up to Saint Hill, just behind Orania, and we do 4 short runs, one long one up the hill, and 4 short ones. The athletes still do it every now and then, and one long one, and we jog back. And yes, and that made me extremely fit. And then on the Wednesday, I'd be with Puti Iman. I'd do like 150 meters runs with scrum machines. And then the English came to play. And hopefully I can get you the video. And they played us here. But I had 2 instances where I came around the back of the line and I just ran. And the one guy was hanging onto my jersey, and I'm running with, I think, the one flanker of theirs, and another one I ran through them, and I basically through that and through trials that I played with Shimlas against Pika and with playing against Western Province, I basically got picked on merit for that Springbok team in 1994.
Wow. And then obviously you made your debut at Loftus. Unfortunately, didn't get the result. But can you just take me through that game from what you remember?
Yeah, so when you play your first test, it's like a blur. You're in this world of and they just give you clothes and your blazer. So the emotions and all the, it's to process it. I think it's easier now, but then you're just in this hamster wheel, and we were only allowed to join the team on the Tuesday. It was international law. So about a week before, Ian McIntosh flew a lot of players up to do a bit of scrums, but it was totally hush-hush illegal. And then we got together on the Tuesday, so you had a bit of a practice. Then you had media and everything. So there was no, focus on the battle ahead. It was all this distractions. And then also it takes time for a team to become a good team, So just to throw a bunch of top talented people together, you actually have to stick with them, And what happened that game, and in those days it was frightening. If you got picked, even if you had a broken, you just pitched for the game, because if you don't, you just get taken out by the next player. There was no, this is the 15 in the team. There was no place for other people. So 3 of the guys in the team actually played with injuries. And you'll see after the game there were, I think, 5 guys dropped. 4 of them were actually injured going into the first set, and I was the only guy that actually had a good game, if you could look at it. But they said, no, he's too young, we need somebody older. And they brought in Johan Leroux, which was seen as a bit of a meanie, and Bali Swart went to Lucid. But if you just look at it today analytically, as a rugby player, I was way better than but the attitude was, no, he's young, we've got to get older guys in. And then it was amazing. Joost and Mark Andrews made their debut after me the next week, and you can just look at how their careers actually ended up. So that was maybe fantastic to be picked for that side. Maybe it would have been better to be picked a week later. Who knows, But that also created an interesting dynamic. Now you're here, you've basically been fending for yourself since 13, just winging it. And now you've been dropped. First time ever in my life I've been dropped, and it was out of a test team. So the emotions around that was very, you get the DCM, you read it in the newspaper, you're not being picked on Monday. And you can imagine what that does to your mindset and your mind. And funny enough, the Wales were here, and I was sitting there, and the guy was chatting to us, and he said, guys, do you understand the support this young man needs now? And you could see people that had no idea about that. today there's very serious mental health support for players in that position. And then I went and played for the Free State, but now obviously, you know, you're not demotivated, but you're a bit, you know, you're looking at this perspective, and in my view, you know, it's not about being fair. It wasn't done in a fair way. The decision wasn't made in a way that you can understand why the decision was made. I played enough trials against everybody to show I'm by far the best player. I actually had a good game if you go look at it. Yeah. You know, the English were well, that's why the British Lions is such a difficult side to play against, because they always start on tour and one or two teams beat them, but then they become a battle-hardened unit knowing how to play together. So we walked into this England team that got beaten by the Free State. You go look at, but they actually became a good team. So it was two teams. One was a good team and maybe not as many good individuals. The other one was a lot of good individuals, but they weren't a good team yet. And that's what made us lose the game, you know, and to process that was hard. And then obviously I came to the Free State, and a couple of things went against us. There was an incident where I was playing a game at Picker again, and they scored against us, but there was things that happened beforehand and the guys didn't stick to the game plan. So you frustrated, irritated, we committed to something, and the main guys saying the commitment aren't really doing it. And now we in this place, and I was standing behind the poles with my hands on my knees with the number 1 on my back and my red socks and my black pants, and the one spectator screamed, "Ollie Leroux, jy lyk soos 'n spaarvarkie." Piggy bank, you know. And my reply to him wasn't as nicely constructed. It was obviously a bit expletive. And then I got dropped for a guy called Henry Boshoff. And when that happened, I was sitting at home, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Ian McIntosh. And he was the Springbok coach, and he said, "Ollie, I see you've been dropped. Don't you want to come to Natal?" I said, "I'm in." Simple. You know, because if these guys drop me for somebody that's clearly not even in my league, you know, then why should I stay here? And me and Henty Martins went down, structured the deal, negotiated, came back, went, and then I phoned Rassie, Werner Swanepoel, Tokkie Kasselman, and V.E. Fisagi was one of the under 20 players. I said, "Guys, you must come down here," because they were paying us under the table. Like we were getting as much money for club games as the Free State was paying us. I think we were getting 700 Rand a game then. And then obviously, no, it was insane, Bruno. I get a check for $700. I think I was working for 36 Rand a night as a bouncer then at Billy's Bar and at the university. You know, so now you got to see. We just pissed it out the first 2 checks. And then I said, "Well, boys, let's get a bit of behavior, yeah." But there it was just and they actually came down and they played a game for collegians and to bring them down to Natal. And about a week later, Ian McIntosh phoned me or called me in. He says, "Ollie Leroux, you prick. Why did you bring those guys down?" And I said, "Yeah, but they're good players and they can." He says, "No, but now the Free State has seen it and they've picked them and they're a much better side." So to this day, I believe if it wasn't for me going to Natal, Rassie and Werner, they wouldn't have gotten the opportunity. Oh, wow. And that's how it worked, you know. And what's nice is today you can clearly see you know, if a player is not valued, or there's so much opportunities for him to actually go. In those days, it was, you know, I remember somebody like the scrum of. What's his name? Robert played for Natal. Robert Aprea, he was playing with Nas and he had a long pass. So you pass a long pass to Nas, he would just kick you to pieces. And he then moved to Natal. The next minute the army came and said, no, you never did your army, because while he never got conscripted. So the guys in the Blue Bulls kept him out of being conscripted. And when he moved to Natal, they said, you're going to get conscripted now. No, that's how it worked. And then luckily Ian McIntosh went to the army guys down there. There's a big army base there. He said, no, you guys got to make sure you get conscripted. Yeah.
That's
insane.
The
type of stuff that was going on, you know, and how they paid you basically in those days was you would get your fees for traveling and stuff for the unions, and they'd have guys giving you work behind the scenes. And then also on the, obviously with the rugby, you'd have a nice network, and then the clubs would actually pay you like in cash for playing for them, you know. So that's how we were supposed to be amateurs, but semi-amateurs. And then what's amazing, the transition then happened in '96, where the game became professional. So I grew up in a game that was an amateur game, and then I was in the transition to professional, and then it was fully professional. But the values of the amateur game is a little bit not prevalent now, but a lot of the amateurs went into the bureaucracy and to the coaching of the game, but that evolution has stayed behind. So I think the game's evolved to a certain stage, but a lot of the people that are still in the admin structures and stuff are actually to run a high performance system like this, they actually got no idea, you know. They're not, but they were just pulled in those days, and without sounding, it would be the school coaches and the headmasters that would sit on the board, and suddenly these guys became admin people in this massive corporate structure, and the game struggled with that a lot. You know, you can just look at what's happened at the Cheetahs, how that you know, someone like Harold Verster went out. That was part of that transition, and the next guys came in, but you can see something's wrong, and that's just the Free State. You know, you can actually go look at all the other unions. They're really struggling with that. And then because the amateur side, and rugby never wanted to lose their amateur, they didn't want professional like the NFL guys. They want to keep the amateur basis. But in keeping that, the evolution of the administrators, I believe, is way behind where the players are at this moment. And within the next, I say 5 to 10 years, I think that will start getting much more streamlined and aligned. And I think rugby will grow as a sport at levels we don't understand.
So that's so strange. So basically, guys would have to work other jobs to support themselves while playing rugby.
We played rugby because we love playing rugby.
Really?
And that's what I look at guys. Now it's a profession. Now rugby's a profession.
Yeah.
So
you do it full time.
And you start most of your professional careers at 23. You know, so you get developed till then, and then you start, and then you've got about most guys have a 30-year lifespan there. But as a rugby player, obviously, it's just if you're lucky, it's 20. You know, but very few get to 20, so make it 15, and then you've got to start a new journey. You've got to get, it's like death. You get all your finances in order, you say goodbye to everyone, and you start over. And that transition in life is really tough in your mental health. You know, now you got to go. And I remember Mark Andrews had a great story, and he was also finished, and he always had Mizuno as his sponsor. Okay, so you had a couple of sponsors. I was very blessed. I still got my first sponsor from Stefan Klopper at Klopper.
Oh, wow.
And I went to him, and Ruben Kruger had just gone to Northern Transvaal, and ASICS was looking for somebody to sponsor. And he said, I think you must sponsor Ollie Leroux. And he actually, Stefan Klopper, got me my first ASICS sponsor. So that was insane, playing with the ASICS, you know. Then you had, it was just boots. They give you 2 pairs of boots a season, you know. And we still, those days, had the studs that you had to draw. It was a whole different, the equipment was different. And then, you know, and today the kids are so entitled. You know, I remember my first game for Free State, they actually give you a pair of boots and tackies, and it was such a privilege. But now people think it's a right. But also the values of the amateur, or how we played and why we played. We really played for the love of the game. And you worked a job, and you came and you played rugby in the afternoons. You would train from 6 till 8, go work between 1 and 2, you'd go do something, and then from 5 you'll train till 7, and then, you know, Andre Venter would come and say, come Ollie, we go do some extra training in the gym. And that's what you just did because you loved the game. Yeah, you got to, you know, but that was how it worked. And today it's gone away from that a little bit because, you know, you're making proper money now, and you can, but that balance, I think, was very good in those days, you know, because you could, you know, guys like Val Bartman, if you look at the business they've built, a guy like Andre Venter with their networks, you know, a guy like Andre Venter had every single function. He would just always get business cards on Monday. He'd be phoning the Oaks and making business deals. A guy like Adrian Garvey was great like that. But then Mark Andrews with his Mizuno sponsorship was playing golf with the owner or somebody, and the guy said, yeah, you rugby players are useless. And Mark is a very intelligent, outspoken guy with strong opinions, like a lot of the rugby players are. And he said, yeah, but you know what, how many times have you met Nelson Mandela? How many times have you met the Queen of England? He said, now you want to make me a rep? Come on, bro, I've got qualities of working in high performance. Give me a proper opportunity. I said, phone me on Monday, 9 o'clock on Monday. Mark Andrews is on the phone. Here I am. And the guy gave him, speaking under correction now, but the Spalding brand. And they did 1.5 million rand out of Spalding last year. And Mark went, said, what am I getting paid? What's my goals? And the guy didn't really think it. And I think by the third month, he had already made the sales 2 million rand a month, just because he could go in there. And then from there, and I think that's where a lot of the transition comes in, you know, as a rugby player, as a sportsman, as somebody that's been in an extremely high performance world, where you have to be efficient, perform every week, take criticism, stand up, you know. You've got so many qualities, but how do you fit into life? Because now this guy, I've played a 15, 18, 20-year career. The guy looks at me and he's worked in his career. So he's also become a battle-hardened veteran, understanding how it works. So how do you fit in? And there's a big a gap for rugby players. Some guys do it easily. They've got, but there's a big gap. If you really put all your energy into your rugby, into your career there, to stop and then start a new career, it's a very difficult challenge for most guys. Some players are lucky. They've got family backup or stuff, but if you're just alone and going at it, it's a tough environment to be in.
So, how difficult was that transition for you? You know, obviously from finishing up your rugby career in 2008 and then basically having to start all over. I mean, what was that transition like for you?
Yeah, it's difficult because it's very difficult because, like I said, you get your finances in order and you say goodbye to everyone. It's like death. And then you start over, and death is after somebody's died, is a year of mourning. And in that year, now you're trying to find, you are, what am I? And a lot of your identity is caught up in rugby. I am this rugby player, but you're so much more than that. It's just a small part of you. So that's the next phase to understand who you are, what qualities works for you, what don't work for you, how we take it from there. And then the next step basically is to say, okay, you know, what do I have to do next? And then the big mistake that guys make then is they start businesses or they get into environments that's not the right environment for them. Sure. And then you know, and then if things go wrong there, you start eating up into your reserves, but not just so much financial reserves, mental reserves, network reserves, you know, and there's no assistance. You're on your own, you know, so it's a very difficult thing. And also for your family, you know, you got to look after them. There's this journey with them that comes because you normally have young kids as well. Then you must be a father and learn that whole skill. So it puts a lot of pressure on you. And then also the way that we rugby players are, you know, we don't have time to discuss the scrum. Yes, but you got a scrum. You know, so now you're going to this corporate world and the oak wants to discuss the scrum and you go, yes, it's bro scrum, you know. And that intensity freaks people out in that environment because, you know, you're used to that. So also adapting to what how this network outside of rugby works. It's a journey, and you don't get it right. You just try every day to be better than the next day, learn from the lessons, and the biggest thing is just to get a bit of, you know, to get stability, and you're the author of your life story, what you're going to write next, you know, so you, and to have support with that, not just to make decisions on your own. And what's very nice is I see there's a lot of mental health movements now that are coming in to help the players, especially with that transition phase in your life, which we never had. And that's why when they put all these great videos and stuff up, you look at them, but I don't think people understand the emotional and physical cost that it actually took. And I do this with a lot of respect. I've looked at a lot of guys that's gone to the army and went into real serious battles, life and death, you know, in Angola and all those places. And if you chat to them, I started realizing at one stage, you know, we used to play every weekend would basically be war and you'd be in a battle. But what people understand, we would have Tuesday practices, Corpus Stomp, where that would be it, because you would actually have to battle this guy to dominate him physically, to actually go do it on Saturday again. So we actually came out of a a form of warfare, if you want to use it with a lot of respect to people that have been in war, you know, but the same fight, flight, freeze, you've got to smash, you know, the same mentality and the aggression that goes with that, you know, and now you've got to go into normal life where those, you know, yeah, everybody's in a battle, but it's not as defined as this, you know, and then also learning coaching rugby, you know, how to handle that. It's very, very, it's a difficult world. So I think a lot of the old players struggle with a bit of post-traumatic stress that comes from being in a form of warfare every weekend, in and out, and you're not just fighting for the team to win, but you're basically fighting for survival. And when it's over, boom, see you later, don't come Monday, you know. So that's definitely the tough part in it. But what's nice, there's a lot of players that's done it. What I've learned is, you know, it's done, move on, you know, don't. A lot of people still live in the past and get a lot of their identity from that. And that's small little things that's part of your evolution, that you've got to adapt to who you really are outside of this wonderful game of rugby, you know. And if you look at that journey, it's tough. It's tough, trust me, it's tough. It's not for everyone. But it also teaches you a lot about yourself, about how to basically adapt to normal life, you know, without that, and still keeping the right qualities that you use as a rugby player, but to just refine them, maybe from being that young testosterone-driven, mood everything, and just go hard to a bit more balance. So it's not a journey.
So obviously you're from a much older generation. Would you say that mental health and that whole concept was something that was very taboo when you were playing?
Yeah, I think mental health definitely has been exposed a lot now, you know, and what is mental health? You know, it's about being in the moment, being calm, collected, breathing, or being in a place of anxiety, fight, flight, or freeze, you know. So your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system, and how the balance between the two happen, and not one is right and not one is wrong. Hey, if a tiger jumps through that door, your sympathetic nervous system goes and you fight, flight, or freeze, you know, and that you need that as a biological being. But I think with the processes today in place, and the people must understand, it's like, you don't get fit by training once. You get fit over years, and you keep and you raise your level every time. So I think and the support people have nowadays in that field is absolutely amazing. You know, in the old days, you'd be just labeled as being crazy or being, you know, but now there's actually programs that people understand it better, you know, and how to apply the tools that you need to get to that. And obviously a lot of it comes out of trauma, you know, and how you process trauma. And what I did in a small way, whenever I had an incident or something that was traumatic, you know, obviously you got to deal with it and all the emotions and stuff. But then at one stage, if you think back to it and you get all the anger or the resentment or the sadness or the emotions, I always looked for something of gratitude in what happened that I could focus on. And then I'd put that memory of gratitude in that little place of trauma. And the more I think of it, the first thought that would come up, yeah, it was bad, but wow, I'm grateful for it. And then eventually the gratitude would actually take that negativity of the trauma and the mental state it put me in, and put me in a state of calm, you know, and that person has to do for himself. And some days you fail horribly. And some days you do it well, you know, so just try your best.
Was there ever a point in your career where you felt as though it was getting a bit much?
Put it this way, I would still be playing rugby today. I just love playing rugby. It's like, yes, what a privilege to be able to play this game and smash into people, and they're just like, And I was a good rugby player. I could play rugby, I was all the physical attributes, that goes without saying, but I could actually play rugby, and I loved playing rugby. And I grew up in a very amazing era because we had players like Donnie Gerber, Naas Botha, then you had the forwards as well, but everybody wanted to be Donnie Gerber. So I grew up as a prop, but I wanted to play like Donnie Gerber.
Did you get the opportunity to play with him?
I think I played a game against him, and I played a game against Naas as well, So please understand the generations of players I played against. I still played with Jannie Breed, Dion Lotter. They were 37 when I was 19. So I played with that generation. It was total amateurs, and then the transition came to semi-amateurs with then basically Val Bartman. I still played his last game with him for Natal. He was the Springbok captain. Then Gary Teichmann came in, okay, and then Gary went on his journey. And that was when the big transition between professionalism and semi-professional happened, because Gary was our 95 captain. Then you had Francois Pienaar with the Springboks. Then you had Gary. Then you had Joos and Corne and a bit of the transition. And then the next generation came. And I think the last player I still played with that's still playing, there's one or two. But it was, I think, Dion Fourie. Actually, he was a youngster when I went to help out the Stormers, and Rassie still called him Brandewyn Baba. Rassie had these nicknames for players, and he says, "What's this little youngster?" And look at him today; he's a 35 years old player. So I had that amazing privilege to have this great variety of eras that I actually played over and was in the game with. So. And how it's changed is insane. If you just look at the athletes that I know, Japie Mulder, one stat was, if he went over with a 1963 or 1953 touring squad, he would have been one of the locks in the side. In 94, he was a centre. And now you've got a guy like Andre Esterhuizen that's actually a hybrid player that could be a flanker or a centre. So just how the athletes in the game has evolved and where we are, it's just a different game, and to be part of a bit of that is quite an amazing experience.
So let's talk about 1995. So obviously you made your debut in 94, and now 95 you guys have the World Cup, but now you ended up not being picked. So how did you find out that you weren't picked?
Yeah, so that was a bit of an interesting one. So in 1994, at the end of the year tour, there's a history to this. Kit Christie came in, and his big thing, this is an ambulance job. We got to do this, and then he went with that Transvaal side, and I think in 1994 they won the Currie Cup. Okay, and Francois Pienaar was very strong. I think they won the Super 10 as well. So they had a very strong base core of players. And then when Kitch, and there was always a bit of a provincialism. You must understand, provincialism at that time was insane, bro. I hated that played for Natal. It was like, so the guys wouldn't sit around the same table, and there was two very strong personalities with Francois Pienaar and Tiaan Strauss. And I believe Tiaan Strauss was by far a player that could have made the team, but because of the power struggle that could have been in the team with provincialism and stuff, they didn't pick him. And then in 94, Kitch basically called me and said he's rating me as his fifth prop. It was Osti Rand, Gary Pagel, Bali Swart, and there was a guy called Ian Hutting that they moved to Tighthead that he picked above me on the tour. So I was the fifth loose head, from going from 100% being the top guy to suddenly fifth. And then you look at a guy like Kitch and you go, okay, I've got no respect for your rugby knowledge because you're wrong. Okay. Secondly, what you're basically telling me, you're not even giving me a fair chance. So what do I have to do? How do I make this team? Do I come beg and please keep me? Stuff you, bro. And Gijsie Pienaar was in that conversation. And then what happened the next year? They had a problem at Free State because now Os was playing and I was playing. But Os wasn't. They couldn't play him ahead of me. But you didn't want Os on the bench, you want both of us on the field. And I could play hooker, and I can play tight head, and I played tight head. I think we still beat Canterbury by 50 points. I scrummed against Richard Lowe, handled myself not very well, but I survived. Knowing how to play tight head is an art, and they just throw you in, And nobody helped you in those days. Nobody helped you, because if you taught a guy how to play, he could be in position. So you got thrown in there as a 20-year-old and just wing it, okay? And the toughest position on the field is tight head. And then we got to, and I made a mistake. I should have, but it was so demotivating when an oak comes to you and he says stuff like that, and then you go, you know what? And then I got picked for the Springbok camps, and Kitchell came to me and said, why are you not fit? And you should be fit. You could be an asset to this team, because you can play 1, 2, and 3, and, and everything. And I looked at him, I said, but explain to me, how do you pick Ian Harting ahead of me in your whole life? You cannot explain that. Even the guys ahead of me. Ossie's under pressure when I play, because he won't play ahead of me, because we were both great players. And then this is your view. I don't understand it. And he looked at me, and then I was in the squad. I had a bit of a shin splints, because we were running on tar roads and everything. And then I was in this team playing well, and we had a game against, it was a Springbok Invitational side against the Western Province side. And we were playing, and before the game, Gijsie Pienaar came and said, Ollie, just scrum well, play a good game, you're in the squad, you'll make it. We go, so what happens? Here comes Western Province. They've got a point to prove they're a good team. We're against the guys. Andrew Patterson was there, a hooker against James Dalton. Now, a tall hooker versus a short hooker is always a bit of a problem, because if the tall hooker stands up, your leverage is just in a different situation. And Barry Pagel was, Andrew Patterson was a strong scrumming hooker. I scrummed against Keith Andrews, which wasn't even he physically wasn't my size, so it wasn't. And then on that side, they had Gary Pagel, and then on my side, I had James Dalton and Marius Herter. In the first scrum, we went in, and as I stood there, I just felt my right hand go like, and they popped Marius Herter straight over the scrum. And obviously it wasn't a good scrum performance, and I held my own and actually dominated Keith Andrews. You can go look in the videos. And then the next morning, we got called to Morne du Plessis' room, and Gary Teichmann was there, and say Henry Honeyball, myself, and say, I think it was say Justin Swart or somebody else. And we walked in, and everybody got told, you're not being picked now. We were still, as you go up from the waterfront, you go past this hotel on the road, the Protea Hotel. And I went in, and he told me, and okay, we know. It is what it is. And I walked out, and Gary Teichmann looked at me and says, that was weird. I said, why? He says, because I knew I wasn't going to get picked. Lem and them as well. I don't know why I called this meeting. So I must have been in the side, and then suddenly somebody just made a call on that evening. And I was actually on the reserve bench. And then what happened when James Dalton had his incident with against Canada, a guy like Naka Drochi came into the squad, and he got his 1995 colours, So today you'll see when the guys go, and this is what's so amazing about the evolution of the game. Even the guys that were just on the fringes go and get their World Cup medals. In those days it wasn't like that. The 15 that went on, so it was a very different structure. And then obviously what happened after that was quite cool. The game became professional, and then all the World Cup Springboks got contracts, and all the rest of us had to wing it with the provinces. And then basically 2 years later, the whole field changed, because all the World Cup oaks were out and new guys were in, and now nobody had contracts. And then all the negotiation, then the fun started, because everybody was winging it. And there was actually an incident where they were talking about money in 97, and they were going, and Rian Oberholzer was sitting there. He's now still with Sarfu, and Andre Markgraaff, and they were just not thinking about it, and they needed another R1 million on budget to just get the playing field, paying the guys equal. And at one stage, Henry Honeyball sat there, and he looked at Andre and says, sorry, Andre, do you mind if I leave? He says, where are you going? He says, no, if I leave now, I'll get home before dark. And he said, sit down. And they went back, and 15 minutes later, they had another R1 million in the budget. And it wasn't for Henry Honeyball. He didn't do it for himself. He did it for the whole team. And there's incidences where a lot of leaders in the team actually went and they said, okay, we'll up your salary, just get the team to sign. And that's a bit of old stories that we might not, but that was the values that a guy like Henry Honeyball had. You know, he was always a team man. He was a guy that it was never about himself, and that's what he got right. Just by saying I'm leaving now, the guy said you just sit down, $1 million for the players around the table. And in those days, you know, it's a lot of money. The guys get paid that now probably per month, but in those days it was serious money to get the whole squad to go.
Was there a particular reason as to why you weren't picked for the 1995 World Cup side?
Sure, that's a difficult one to answer, and I think in those days you had selectors, committees and everything, and obviously provincials, and there was a big factor would be me being a bit of an outspoken individual, and obviously my age would be something that they would look at, and also in the team sometimes, you know, but this is just conspiracy theory, you didn't want the main player to feel he's being pushed by other players the whole time, you know. So, and Kitch, you know, if you look at his success and what he did in 14 games in a row, winning a World Cup and doing what he did, you know, building on Ian McIntosh's foundation, you know, you can't really fault that and sound like a bit of a crybaby, you know. So, it was definitely, if I was a bit more experienced, it would have maybe been a different, you know, had more time to set myself. It was definitely a transition period between players as well. So it's a very difficult period then, and there was no consistency in selection. It was genuine. The new coach came in, clean swept, and then the new guys played. You know, it was insane. And you can just look at when Andre Markgraaff came, how many guys from Griquas made the team, you know, and I played with them, good players, they made it, you know, very few, 1 or 2 played test matches, but hey, at least I gave my players that were loyal to me, I gave them the backing to make the Springbok squad, you know. So it was a bit of that type of thing, and like I say, you know, there's not really any reason you can put it. I should have maybe worked harder, I should have been more dedicated, I should have, but you know, you just had no support then, you know, it's like weird, you just got to figure this out on your own. You know, and later on you would, the fitness guys would be guys that you'd go spend, you know, and you'd get to know people in the team. And those days politics were also, yes, you can imagine, you know, because with the political background that South Africa had, you know, all those things were, it was a very different game than today. And you know, sometimes you get picked, sometimes you don't. It wasn't really in those days, it wasn't like today where you can actually go to the coach and hold them accountable. What was your, you know, then the coach was this authoritative figure that you'd never challenged, you know. And you can imagine me when I was in Grey, and you can verify this with Mr. Falstead, he still said I was the guy that hated the ring of the bell the most that they ever had. So I hated patriarchal structures and putting me in a box, and I didn't fit into the box. What do we do? Rather leave him outside, and because we can't manage this box, you know. And I think maybe that would be also a part to play. And we'd love to have been in that squad, but it was also a blessing in the guys. You know, maybe a blessing in disguise. And basically from there moved to the Sharks, had a great seasons there, and made the 99 World Cup, and the other 2 World Cups then was also a bit of personality clashes, and it was never about competence. That's one thing that gives me a lot of peace. I was never let out because I was by far the right. They could have picked me, but it was more about the personality and how do we, you know, manage that. I think it was more than physical rugby playing ability. Sure. And that gives me comfort, because if you put me today in the position where I was with the wisdom of now, I would make all those teams hands down, because I was really I am and I was a good rugby player, and at that stage I was actually one of the best players out there in South Africa, in my view. Obviously people can have it, but I was in the top 3 at least. So I think that gives me a bit of You know, and the fact that after that I played 54 tests, I played 89 games for the Springboks. When we look at the midweek games, and also you got to earn respect. You know, I believe maybe at that stage I hadn't earned enough respect yet, because you can imagine one of the older players would rather back their buddy that's been scrubbing with them for 10 years than this little youngster. So you got to earn respect, and you know, you just don't get it when you get to that level. And I think that's something I take a lot of comfort in. You know, that I know I ability-wise, it was never about that. It was maybe more about the personality and how the guy does not sit in line, and you know, he actually is a bit outside the box. And it also cost me in 2003 and 2007. But that's a discussion for another day when we really go into depth.
I actually want to ask you a question regarding the Sharks. So obviously you were playing for the Cheetahs, and then you got into a bit of trouble because when you responded to the guy who chirped you, obviously your response had to do with his mom. But then you went on to say that, you know, you got a call and you went straight to the Sharks. And my question is, was that allowed? Because obviously you're a Cheetahs player now going to the Sharks. It's like, is that allowed?
We were amateurs, so it was allowed, but not really allowed, you know. So the unions would discuss stuff, but the Sharks had enough money to just tell the Cheetahs, what's the number? There's a number, exit, you know. And also, you know, there wasn't real rules that they could keep you because you played a club game or stuff, but there was ways to get around it. And I think the way that Ian McIntosh and them approached it with Keith Parkinson and Brian, yes, I forgot his surname, the CEO, wow, they were proper statesmen, those gentlemen, you know, they had a lot of wisdom around them, and they knew how to handle this. You know, they brought Vleis Versace, they brought Val Bartman, they got Robert de Pre there, so they knew how to do it. And then they basically just, and you know what, if I play for you, I give everything. Sure. And then you pick a guy ahead of me that doesn't even have 15% of the ability. All it tells me, you don't back me. You know, and basically that, you know, how do you, oh, no, I'm the coach, I'm picking you. You don't. So it was a very difficult position for the Free State, because they, you know, and before me talks went, and then, you know, so there was always the Free State's a bit of a funny side, because it gives young players opportunities, but then it loses them, you know, and then the next young player gets the opportunity, you know. That was the trend over years for the Free State. Guys would come, and then the big checks would come out, they'd move to new provinces. And that's what made the Free State strong, because you could build a strong team for 3 to 5 years, and then it's going to be depleted. But then you got this massive youngsters coming through, and a couple of old guys you can come back. And that was our recipe in 2005. You know, you had myself, Naka, Os Durant in the team, which were older, and Os was a bit more with the Springboks. And then you had the youngsters, Jannie du Plessis, Wiaan de Pre, Michael Claessens, you know, all these oaks that were basically 22. And then you had the core, Reino van der Merwe, Jean Smit, Willem de Waal, the guys that actually was the core. And you had the advisory board, the main board, and then you had the youngsters below us. And I think that's more, as an amateur in those days, they couldn't hold you to contracts, because then they're outside of line as well. So it was a bit of a tightrope that you had to work with, and yeah, it was a very strong move for me, because I went there in '95, we won the Currie Cup, and then the next year they brought a fitness trainer called Kevin Stevenson. He came from soccer, and he had a very simple philosophy. It was about power, speed, and agility. And he started putting that in. So if you look at the Sharks and the rugby we played in 1996, you know, we went through that Currie Cup season undefeated. We arrived back from New Zealand. We only left on the Tuesday. We arrived back the Wednesday evening, and we played a game on Saturday, and we gave some team 50. I think it was Picker again. I think we gave them 70 points with our reserves, because the Springboks weren't there. That's how good we were, you know, and the fitness base we had. I still remember we started And then the first week was easy. The next week we went, and then after the session, we had to run a 400. And then the next week we had to run 2 400s. And the next week 3 400s. The next week 4 400s. And then they scaled it down again over our preparation period. And I started off running my first 400, say, in 65 minutes, around the 65 seconds. And I ended up my last one about, say, 53 seconds. And I did 4 of them, you know. So the program that they put us on, we were by far the most professional team. The way we were playing, you know, Ian McIntosh's style of rugby, 15 versus 7 with flow, and the players we had, you know, it was incredible. That 1996 Sharks team was probably one of the best provincial teams. I watched the game the other day where we played. Hopefully you can find it on the disc where we played, and we finished the Super 12. Listen how insane this schedule was. We finished the Super 12 and we started playing within 3 days. We played our first Currie Cup match, and I played 3 Currie Cup matches before they picked the Springbok side for the incoming tests and the Tri-Nations. And I remember our last game was still against the Lions before the team got picked. And we were down, and it was basically the World Cup squad playing against the 1998 World Cup squad. That was and there were like 40,000 people at the game. And if you watch the game, the intensity and how we played, it was really, you know, those days, those games were like test matches. And I think that's the nice way that the rugby was in about playing rugby. Do all this other stuff outside the field, but I always find if you play 3 games in 2 weeks, it's actually become battle hardened and rugby fit, if it makes sense. Where today they nearly put the guys in cotton wool, and you know, half the youngsters aren't allowed to play because what if they get injured? Well, you got a jaw. If you get injured, you get injured, you know. But if you don't play, you can't learn how to play rugby. You don't get better, you know. And it's nearly like today's players. I remember I played a game. I was at Wits. And on the Friday night, I played for the Transvaal under 20s. On the Saturday morning, I played for the Wits under 20s against the Roodepoort under 21s. Then I went and I sat on the bench. I played for the second team and sat on the bench for the first team. And I got paid like $300 for the Transvaal game was $800. And then it was $300, $600 and $1,000. So I made like $2,000 over the weekend playing rugby. It was like insane, you know. But I actually played 4 rugby matches in 24 hours. People just today wouldn't understand that, you know, and that's where I sometimes think that, you know, you've got to play rugby to become a good rugby player. And nowadays, with all the off-field stuff and the analysis and this and this and this and this, people actually forget why you're playing the game is actually to play rugby matches. And then you look at guys that played, yes, I think I played 380 or 450, and then Stefan de Blanche broke my record. I broke Vleis Versace's record of how many games that you played. 400, you know, and today the guys are also doing it, but that's how you become a good rugby player. Play a rugby, you know, not do video analysis and go to the gym and listen to the coach telling you this is the most important game of your life. Actually play the game, see what you've done, and analyze it. And what was amazing, you know, in our days we had video cassettes. So you'd watch the game on video, okay? And you'd fast forward and you'd go back. And then if you want to cut the game, you had to have one video, another video. And yeah, a guy like Ian McIntosh sit for 4 or 5 hours, go through the game, do it. Rassie had in his room, he had a video machine, and he would watch the games like that and analyze them. If I can tell you, I think you've got, say, 400 games on your hard drive, and I watched every single game on that hard drive, more than once, some of them. What I've learned about the game, what I've seen about the game, how I analyze the game is insane. And I've lately had a massive problem with the referees. You know, we had the Varsity Cup last year with CUT, and the referees then come and they all these brass. I'm now the boss, and I'm this main oak. I've got a voice. Half of them, you know, most of them have got that attitude. And one stage I look at the referee, I say, do you understand that I've played this game and I've played the rules since I was 3 years old with my father? Okay. I've analyzed the game. I've analyzed it. I actually know and applied the rules more than you and understand it better than you. And then you have this disrespect for me as a competent person that's actually spent millions of hours in this game that I love, and you come and tell me how it should work. I can blow a game, I'm telling you, by standing on the middle line, because you just know what's happened out of experience. And I found there's a massive disconnect in rugby today, not so much at the high levels. There's a couple of referees that are really competent, and the way they're using the assistant referees, absolutely amazing, you know, because it's clear, you know. But you still get, and I laugh at people, when you went to play at another home field of another team, it was very simple. Except when you got Andre Watson at the Bulls they cheated. Simple. Okay? No, and I'll show you video evidence. I actually found the one Rev one I said, you cheated, and you could see the Canterbury Oaks looking at him, but you're cheating now, and you'd have that, and no accountability. Maybe somebody cheated for us once or twice, you don't know. But if you go to another place's home field, the 50-50 call is going to go against you. Guaranteed. And now people are surprised when it happens. It's like, come on, boys. That's the way it is. The referee will always blow the 50-50 call for you. Simple. But when it becomes a 60-40 call that starts going against you, there's actually referees cheating. And last year I actually caught a referee cheating, and I've got everything on video, and then I lost so much respect, because you didn't become a respected official with you know, you actually become a cheat, and I think at the lower levels that's our biggest problem. The rugby IQ of the referees compared to somebody like myself that's played the game is so different, but they see themselves as equals. It's like, oh, might be so, okay, so you like that picture. This is the picture you want. Are you sure? Yeah. Then I give them the picture and they blow against me. And I say, but this was the picture I asked you about. And the guys, even the head of the referees can't answer me. And I think that's the one part of this game, especially at lower levels, that we really have to look at, because the referees, they actually do not understand the laws, how to apply and how to play as much as people and players that's done it. You know, if I coach my players, I can see the offside line. I'm hard on the principle. Get off the line, move back, do this, roll away. Then they do it on the team, and the referee will just not understand how well these guys have actually been coached to play the rules. And they'd find a way to manipulate the system to make them the most important person in the room. And I think that's something where I think a lot of old players feel very cast away, if you want to put it. Because if you can imagine, I can look at a scrum and I can help anybody in the world. But now you go and there's this coaching schools that's now suddenly, and you go look at it, and but he's not coaching them well. And a lot of old players have been moved to the side of the game where they actually got so much valuable input, but there's no place for them, because if you do that, you take somebody's job, you know. So it's a very difficult. I believe rugby has been too much infiltrated by people that don't play rugby. In our days, you had Neely Smith, the ex-Springbok coaching. You didn't have Oaks that weren't Springbok players that didn't coach. It was like a brotherhood. Obviously, there's a lot of competence out there and guys that can coach at the highest level with amazing results. If you just think of somebody like Heineke Meyer, you know, what he's done with the Bulls and everything. But I really believe that's where rugby's biggest, we talked about, is the way that they don't understand how to evolve a player into that fold. And then you look at young coaches and you know, great players that you can just look at, and I'll pick them in my Springbok 15 any day and look at them getting hammered at coaching level, because coaching a team and playing under a great coach and being, you think you know what you're doing, you got no idea. You're sitting with personalities, you must know how to manage them. You're sitting with accountability, you're sitting with pressure, and now suddenly you're the oak accountable. And you were a great player, you just got yourself out of shit with talent. Now you got to get yourself out of the trouble with systems and with getting a team to work together and understanding intricacies, you know, and that's where I believe a lot of our teams are underperforming because they don't have enough advisory board type old players that's not there for themselves, but actually for the system to flow. And that part of the evolution will start slowly but surely going. You know, if somebody, I always look at a guy and I say, if that coach tells you this is the most important game of your life, okay, and I've heard that many times. I think that's when you hear that one too many times, you say, I can't hear this anymore. How many times has he been in that situation to say that? He understands. And you look at him, if I tell you how I learned how to tackle, I'll tell you, and they say, how did you learn? And what a small little thing. So we were playing and Jonah Lomu got the ball. Yes, Bruno, when Jonah Lomu gets the ball, everybody's a bit nervous because you just don't pick me. And they'd actually look at you and they'd look you in the eye and they'd smile. You know, okay, it's coming for me. Carlos Spencer would do the same thing. And you know, this oak's now seen space, he's seen a fat prop, and you know everything is against you. And I remember we still kicked a long ball with the Springboks, and Jonah caught the ball and he was running at us. And now it's Jonah Lomu running at you. That's insane. And I saw he targeted me and I thought, okay, I've got visions of Michael Catt going over the French flanker. Yeah, he was a good flanker. He getting run over, and I thought to myself, my whole life, I'm on the oak that ran over me was Scott Gibbs one day, but I'm not going to let that happen again. And I looked him in the eyes and I said, okay, here it goes. And I dropped my eyes to his navel and I said, I don't care what, I'm going to smash this oak with everything I've got. And I looked at his navel and I went for him. And the next minute he like stepped me, and Joe van Niekerk tackled me, and we made the tackle and we got the turnover. And I couldn't understand it because it's against everything. But when I looked at his navel, and the navel is the soft space in they don't want to take contact there. And since that day, I've taught people, when you tackle, look at the navel, look at your point of contact. Don't look at it, because then you're low and you hit him in his soft spot. Because I actually ran against Jonah Lomu and I did it and it worked. And I figured it out. Now, you're a defensive coach. You've never played rugby. Tell me how you tackle Jonah Lomu. And that's just that little example I've given you is what I coach people. It's not about me, Ollie le Roux, this great. It's not about that. It's about, this is what I learned in that situation. This is what I learned. And if you're somebody that learns this game and understands the philosophy of it, you evolve, because now you get another information that adds to this and that adds to that. And then eventually it just becomes second nature and it works. But how do you get that in a coaching degree? How do you go to a level 1 coaching course with that kind of rugby IQ? Now I've got to sit there, you go do the level 1 coaching course. It's like, I have to do it. But you look at it and you think, but this is like amateurs. You know, and that's where rugby is very disconnected at the moment, with bureaucracy and people putting these little things in place, and a guy can go and online do his, now I'm a little coaching, little, bro, what's your CV? What's behind that little thing? And I think that evolution in rugby needs to come as well.
So have you ever considered getting into coaching?
Yeah, I'm a born coacher, so I coach, and I think a lot of that was when I was playing. The guys say, you're always fucking coaching. I said, well, that's simple, because I love the game and the philosophy of the game. I spent like 10,000 hours in it already, but I've had some my coaching career is a little bit different than most people's, because I totally exited the game and I've got no identity in rugby. But then every now and then I get a phone call. It's like, help. And then I get invited and I go and I actually go help. And then I love every second of it, and we get very good results quickly. And just 3 very good examples is I helped CUT 3 years ago with a gentleman called Malusi Matwetwa. And you must go watch that. That is probably he'll be one of the next Springbok coaches. Probably I rate him in the level of a Rassie Erasmus, a Ian McIntosh, a Rod McQueen, a Michael Cheika. Really, really, but like, and he's got the pedigree, bro. He's done it the hard way. And we coached CUT 2 years ago and he got me in very late to avoiding relegation. And in the promotion relegation, we gave the other side of if my one bloody prop caught the ball, we would have scored 100 points against them. And that's an amazing achievement. And then the next year, the two of us helped Saul Plaatjes University once a week for 9 weeks, for an hour and a half, to go from losing against the club champs to beating them, to qualifying at USAS, setting all the records at USAS, and qualifying against Tshwane, proper rugby players, having to play the game again because he was an illegal player, and beating them both times, and then ending out of relegation zone this year, just by helping them a little bit. And then this year I had an amazing time last year with CUT. I basically got asked by Randall Williams, the coach, to come and help him. But I only joined them in January, and we, for the first time in I think 9 or 10 years at CUT, we ended up out of the relegation zone. And that has not happened in 9 years. We even went as far as to beat Aitjies with 14 players for 40 minutes, and they ended up winning the Varsity Cup.
Was this year?
Yeah, it's now last year. Last year's Varsity Cup. Yeah, we beat Aitjies for the first time. We beat Wits for the first time. And the worst part was they still took 5 points away from us from beating UJ. Because they said we had an illegal player, and that was the previous year's administrators at CUT that actually messed it up. They're actually coaching now, and they're back in the system. And they took 5 points away from us they were only allowed to take 2, and they took 5. And if we had those 5 points, we would have been this close to being in the semi, if not making the semis. That's how successful we were. And that's the standard. So we'll hopefully see where CUT ends this year if they can replicate that. But that journey with the youngsters and meeting the young boys, I remember I coached Grey's under 11D team at one stage, and even to this day, if I see those guys, they always, it was the toughest training sessions they've ever had because we didn't know better. So as a coach, I believe you must evolve as well. And coaching, one thing, please understand, there's not one coach. There's at least 5, a minimum of 5. And how they work together is so important, because if you don't work together, if there's no alignment and synergy, you just can't go into this game. Is so many multiple facets of excellence that you need at least 5 coaches just to be able to sort out training sessions. You know, and we would go as far as to get the fitness guy to do a certain session. We do that guy just to have 5 coaches. But coaching today is not a one-man band. It's really a collaboration between more than at least 5 individuals.
So would you do it? Do you do it full time?
No. I just wing it if I get an opportunity and people ask me, I go for it, you know, and it's a conscious decision. I think I can probably go and coach and do all that stuff, but you know, it's not my my career as a coach. You know, it's something. You know, as soon as you coach, if you just look at a lot of the people that's coached, the stress they're under, the way I see Scott Robertson's resigned now for the All Blacks. You know, and how much stress it puts on you, firstly, and then rugby is a very dangerous idol because it consumes you and becomes your family, and a lot of guys will struggle with family relationships and stuff after that. If you can imagine, you're away from home 20, 22, 24 weeks a year. Sure. You know, how do you keep your family intact, and it just takes a lot of that. So there's a balance between the two. I believe that if you coach, you know, I don't think at this moment I can take a bit of time, put it in there, go have a massive impact, have fun, coach, and I'm competent at it. But to have it as a career, it's a very conscious decision. And I don't know if it's something I would like to do now. I love it. I love coaching. You understand? People phone me. It's like, hey, coaching again? Yeah, what they paying you? Nothing. Yeah, you can't do that. Yeah, but I love the game. You know. But at the end of the day, and it's very difficult because guys are in a situation where they're under pressure. But if you move in, somebody else loses his job. You understand? And that's, you know, that's difficult. Yeah. How do you now go and take food off somebody's table? I don't know. So I don't really have an answer for you there. but I love coaching. And what's also very nice, what I've been doing is a lot of people have come to me, please help my son. Please help my son with that. And then they'd send me videos, say, wow, look at how he's scrumming, or look at what he's done. And that to me is like my responsibility as an old player to go help at those. I don't have to have you the coach, but if you see that and you see sometimes just chatting to a young player that's in a situation, nobody's been there. I've been there probably multiple times to be able to give him feedback. And, that gives you a lot of purpose when it comes to rugby.
Now, Ollie, you said something quite interesting. From what I gather from what you've just said, your ability as a coach and your competence a lot of the time is contingent on your experience as a player. So my question would then be, from my perspective, the game of rugby, when I watch it, it's completely different. You know what I mean? So, for example, the guys playing in your generation, I mean, it looks completely different. I mean, the way the teams are set up, the way people scrum, the way people maul, compared to today, where it's a lot more tactical, if that makes sense, and it's completely different. So my question would then be, how does your experience, playing in a completely different era, translate to you being able to coach in a modern sense, if that makes sense?
Okay, so to answer you, the game is exactly the same. All that's happened is guys have realized how they can manipulate the rules and got a guy like Richie Matu was the best cheat that never got caught. You understand? He knew how to manipulate the rules. Yeah. And I think that side has been tidied up. But the one thing that people miss about it, and you get different coaches, and please understand there's competence at all levels. I've learned from coaches that are, but there's a philosophy to playing rugby. And once you understand the philosophy never changes. What do they say? The diesel engine's got to hold. The tight forwards have got to make sure you got good set pieces, and you must win your ball. Nothing's changed in that. Oh. The way they scrum, it doesn't matter. You're allowed to have 4 reserves, okay? In my day, you had 4 reserves. So I was lucky because I could play 1, 2, or 3. So I was a banker for a side because I could cover 3 positions, and you'd have a specialist scrum off, and you needed a lock flank specialist. And then you had a backline specialist. And that was what it was. Today, you've got many more options in that. But I believe to send a fresh pack of players on, having 8 reserves is fine, but to send 8 people on is against what the game started at. It's 15 versus 15, and eventually there's a fatigue factor coming in. A guy gets injured, I can replace him. And I believe that rule's going to change somewhere because they've made the game very statistically advantaged for the attacking side. But it's because of these... they want to make it respectable, but if you can basically get 15 players on the field, and as you wear them down, the holes start opening. On 65, you'll see teams break on 65 to 72 minutes, and the game will be close, and suddenly they'll just break. You'll see Russie's getting it right at levels that insane, because it's a physical battle that you've got to wear the guy down, and eventually, if you've had 8 big scrums, 12, 14, 15 big scrums, and that tight head stands up, his legs are jelly, and the next one, Chesman Colby runs at him. It's like everything's wrong. Brayton Paulson was the guy in our days. He would just run you to pieces in the latter parts of the game because the space would open. But now they send fresh players on, the spaces are gone. So I really believe there's going to come something that you got your 8 reserves, but only 5 substitutions. And if you have a yellow card, you must be able to substitute the player immediately, or a red card, substitute immediately, because now you're losing your reserves at the end of the game, So I think that evolution's coming in that sense. And at the end of the day, it's about the philosophy, and I grew, and I'm a bit of a philosopher in everything I do. And Ian McIntosh, 9 years that guy coached the Sharks. He never lost more than 2 games in a row. And he had a philosophy, how he coached, how he got you to win the 3rd game. And if you understand the philosophy that he did, it works till this day. He'd pitch up on a Monday, and you'd get a WhatsApp, say, be in the meeting. He'd say, you're going out with the fitness guys. We're going to lift the intensity and make sure you run hard. And he wasn't there. And the next day, it's to have a video session saying, this is what we're doing wrong. This is what we're going to do. Everybody shut up. I've spoken to the main responsible leaders in the squad, and we got a plan, and you shut up and you do the plan. Then he'd get a session where he'd have a certain practice that he had, and he would be all over you for the first 30 minutes for the basics and the core principles that he would enforce. And then he would start creating flow. Then he'd put a massive wall in front of you, and you just have to run it to make sure you play to the ball. Then he'd chase everybody away. He'd go and have a game strategy session, and the next day you would go play golf together as a team. And that was Ian McIntosh's blueprint on his philosophy. How do I get a team out of a slump? And he did it very clearly. I'm the boss. You shut up. I know what to do. And we did it. But he had the leaders included. Now, to take that, what I've just told you, put it in a coaching manual, how to get a team from 2 losses down. Hey, bro, that's Ian McIntosh's philosophy. Once you got the philosophy, just evolve with it. See how it works for you. What's your team like, because it's about understanding human beings. Then the philosophy of 15 versus 7. But that philosophy evolves because it starts with a 15 versus 7, then it goes to a 5 verse 2, 4 verse 3. And then it goes back to 15 versus 7. And that's the philosophy. It's standard in the game. And if you understand the game, that's the philosophy. There's very few top coaches out there today that understand that philosophy. It was Rod McQueen and the Brumbies. They invented it. Look at how the Brumbies play. It's all about numbers. Rassie, what he's done now, his philosophy of taking this Springbok unit and putting it into a battle-hardened a war machine, and how he destroys teams. It's simple. It's just a numbers game, and it's philosophy, and it's knowing where your strengths are, knowing where your weaknesses are, knowing, okay, I've got Kanan Moody, Andre, I can pick 6'5" bloody backline players, and if you look how big that Caden Moody is now, he's running against the little 5'8" Welsh player. This is bro, he's got no chance. You know what I'm saying? It's just, and that's a philosophy. A big player, strong, fast, and a small player, strong, fast. Unless you're a Cheslin Colby type player, and actually, there's players that can show that. And we had Kabamba Fleurs, Dion Kaiser, but Tana Omanga had want the physical size would just overpower the smaller guy. That's a philosophy. When do you apply each one? And I think the philosophy of the game is where the true value of coaching lies. And philosophy only comes with years of experience and actually applying the philosophy, seeing how it works. And I think that could maybe be why I'm so comfortable. If you ask me to coach now, I've got a philosophy about rugby that's consistent, that's evolved over years. And now you sit with a person that's actually just coming to the game and learned the numbers. It's like the IQ around the table is where I think a lot of the discrepancies lie. And it's amazing because I'm not in the coal fire. I can sit from a distance and you just look at the picture and you just say, but just change that, and that. And then we get flow. Yeah. And then you look at the approachability of the coach on the other side. Because if he immediately gives you pushback and it's an ego thing, no, but it's about right and wrong, okay, can't work with this guy. But then you get coaches that see and you show them and they go, wow, let's adapt, let's evolve. And those are the good coaches that I work with, and the rigid coaches that are, this is what we do because they're trying to control the game. I could never, a classic example would be somebody like a Rudolf Strauly that would put us in structure, and the structure works, but it never allowed my freedom of expression. Even somebody like Nick Mallett came to me when I played the test at Ellis Park, and Robbie Kempson got sick, so my only test I could face the haka as a starter. And he came to me and says, you must play like Robbie, you must clean and do this and this. But I'm absolutely not that kind of player. I do all that work, but I'm different. And in the match, you'll see I run. If I listened to him, there was a ball, I would go and I would have cleaned and done my job. I picked the ball up, run past it to Robbie Fleck, he scores under the post. I played scrum half. He never said, well done or anything. Oh, you should have cleaned, you know what I'm saying? And it's just like the differences, because a lot of coaches try and control the players, control the field. But once you've got a system going where there's a flow happening and there's a philosophy that you're playing towards, you can actually just stand and watch it evolve, see how it goes. And I think that's the way I like to coach. It's a collaboration, it's an upskillment, but hard on the principle, soft on the person. This is our core skills, build it from a foundation. Once the foundation's set, you bring extra skills and you start building this little pyramid of performance, and how do we perform? I looked at it the other day, and I'm talking a lot now, but if you're a coach and what you have to do, Rassie one day gave us an A4 paper and he had 5 columns and each one had about 20 that he had to tick off because he's got OCD before he played the game on Saturday. And we'd always get a WhatsApp at 7 o'clock, quick team meeting before, and then he ticked the stuff that he didn't say, because that's what you have to think of. It's just so vast. How do you put that into 45 minutes 3 times a week? It's impossible. So you need a philosophy that when you get to the field, you can immediately create flow that gives you a result and gives people to perform together as a team. It's not about coaching stuff, but then there's basic coaching. How do you hold the ball? You don't hold it like this, you hold it like this. How do you pass? You look and you pass. How do you beat? You put all, but you first got to put that foundation in before you can start playing rugby. So there's a definite program that you can actually create a high-performance program that can be repeatable with the resources you have. Obviously, if you're a high-performance institution that needs results, the philosophy stays the same. Nothing from grade 9 to the Springboks. Everything is the same. And that's more the way that I see coaching. It's not about me being right and this is what you got to do. That's how you got to clean. That's how you got to do it. And whenever I reach a team, the first time, I always tell them rugby is a simple game. There's a line. And that once you get over this line and you don't let it.
Yeah.
Simple.
Basics.
That's the philosophy. Yeah. And I measure you on that every time. What does Rassie do? He's got his contact battle, little stress. Yeah. But it's simple. You just watch it. Okay. There Jason's winning the battle. He's winning the battle. He's winning the battle. He's winning the battle. That's what I need. But no, he's not winning the battle. I changed the attack, changed the defense. And if you see where people lose battles, you just attack them on their weakest point. It's like insane. And it works. And I can manipulate that by just having a different line and having a guy doing a different move. And it's very rewarding because it's actually very creative to start getting flow in chaos, but with structure. And it's a different way. People get structure and then they try to get it. We say, no, we like chaos. And in that, we create flow that's actually structured. And that's about people playing together, having communication lines, having a chain of command, knowing what happens, and what happens at that point. What's your job? Make sure the next phase happens. And that's all little building blocks that you put together in practices. And it's all about the philosophy.
So obviously, you've finished up your professional career. You've had a very successful career, obviously accumulating 54 test caps. You've won many titles. My question for you is, once everything is said and done and somebody says the name Ollie le Roux, how would you like to be remembered?
Sure. Depends who you probably ask, but I think, how would I like to be remembered? That whenever I left the system was always poorer off for it. And that whenever I joined the system, that I added value. I think if you can get that right, that when you leave, the system actually is not not a worse place, but by you leaving, the system's a bit deflated. And if you come to a system, if you can be known, I think that would be a good example, because then it means whenever I've been there, I've enhanced whatever system or team I was with. I think if I can get that right 70% of the time, I think I've done well.
And as a person?
Yes, as a person, I think as a work in progress. And as somebody that continually evolved and and live life flat out. Simple. Yeah. So I think that as you get older, you get a bit more philosophical about things like this. But I think if you can just always keep on evolving, learn out of your mistakes, learn when they're happening again, and just live it to the fullest. You can lie in bed all day and just have negative thoughts, or you can actually get up and go walk in the grass or jump in the pool, or just live it. You only got so much time, and one thing I've been very serious on is my return on time, because that's all I've got that's of any value. And if I don't have return on time, that's the biggest assessment for me in value in my life. And hopefully one day when I go, they'll say, wow, but this Oak spent his return on time was massive.
That's a great answer. But yeah, listen, without further ado, listen, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
No, I really, really, really do appreciate it. I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you.
Excellent. No, I appreciate it, and let's go for it.